They did not die for a rumor. They did not give up their lives for a comforting idea. These men claimed they had seen something with their own eyes, and almost every one of them paid for that claim with blood. Before their names were carved into church walls, before painters placed halos over their heads, before history turned them into saints, they were ordinary men. Fishermen with rough hands, brothers with tempers, a hated tax collector, a political radical, a skeptic who refused to believe until he touched the wounds himself. They were not perfect. They were not calm religious statues. They were men who argued, misunderstood, panicked, failed, and ran. And that is exactly what makes their story so hard to ignore, because something happened to them. Something powerful enough to turn fear into courage, ambition into surrender, and ordinary lives into a testimony that would shake the world. When most people hear the 12 disciples, they imagine peaceful faces in stained glass sitting around Jesus as if they understood everything from the beginning. But the Gospels give us a much more human picture. These men were often confused. They argued about who was the greatest. They wanted places of honor. They asked questions that exposed how little they understood. Peter denied knowing Jesus 3 times in one night. Judas stole from the common money bag and later betrayed his teacher for 30 pieces of silver. James and John once wanted to call down fire from heaven on a village that rejected them. These were not flawless heroes. They were real men with pride, fear, weakness, and ambition. And because the Bible does not hide their failures, their transformation becomes even more powerful. The story is not impressive because they were naturally brave. It is impressive because they were not. After the resurrection, their lives did not become peaceful. They did not return home with a private religion and live quietly as moral teachers. The opposite happened. They were threatened, beaten, imprisoned, scattered, exiled, and killed. Some were crucified. Some were stabbed. Some were beheaded. Some were stoned. Some died far from home in places they had never imagined visiting when they were young men by the Sea of Galilee. And here is the question that stands at the center of their story. Why would someone die for something he knew was a lie? People may die for beliefs they inherited. People may die for ideas someone else taught them. But the disciples were different. They were not saying, "We heard this from someone." They were saying, "We saw him, we walked with him, we watched him die, and then we saw him alive." That claim changes everything. If the resurrection was invented, then the disciples were not innocent victims of a rumor. They were the ones who created the story. They would have known it was false. And yet they endured suffering for it over many years in different cities before different authorities under real pressure. They were not facing one emotional moment. They had time to think, time to reconsider, time to walk away. But they did not. Again and again they chose the same testimony. That does not mean every later tradition about every apostle can be proven in every detail. But the central fact remains powerful. The first witnesses were willing to suffer and die for what they claimed they had seen. The first man we have to look at is Simon Peter, because Peter may be the easiest disciple to recognize in ourselves. He was bold, emotional, sincere, and unstable. He could speak with great faith one moment and collapse into fear the next. Peter was a fisherman from Galilee, a man who knew the weight of wet nets and the exhaustion of working through the night. He was not trained in the schools of the religious elite. He was not the kind of man people expected to become a foundation of a movement that would outlive empires. But Jesus saw something in him that Peter could not see in himself. He called him Peter the Rock. At first, that name sounded almost impossible. Peter did not look like a rock. He looked more like a storm. Peter's journey with Jesus was full of contradiction. When Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." It was a moment of breathtaking clarity. But not long after, when Jesus began speaking about suffering and death, Peter pulled him aside and tried to correct him. Think about that. Peter confessed Jesus as the Messiah, then tried to tell the Messiah how his mission should work. Jesus answered him sharply, "Get behind me, Satan." In Peter, we see a strange mixture of faith and fear, love and misunderstanding. He believed in Jesus, but he still wanted a version of the kingdom that made sense to him. That same mixture appeared on the night Jesus was arrested. In the garden, Peter drew a sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. It was brave, reckless, and completely wrong. Peter was ready to fight, but he did not yet understand the kind of kingdom Jesus had come to bring. Then, only a few hours later, the same man who swung a sword in front of soldiers could not admit to a servant girl that he knew Jesus. 3 times he denied him. 3 times he chose fear. And when the rooster crowed, Peter remembered what Jesus had said. He went out and wept bitterly. That failure could have been the end of his story. But after the resurrection, Jesus restored him. 3 times Peter had denied him. 3 times Jesus asked, "Do you love me?" And each time Jesus gave him a calling, "Feed my sheep." Peter's future was not built on the illusion that he was strong. It was built on grace, strong enough to remake a broken man. That is why Peter's later courage is so extraordinary. The man who once trembled before a servant girl later stood in Jerusalem and preached openly that Jesus had risen from the dead. When the authorities ordered him to stop speaking in Jesus' name, Peter did not run. He said, "We must obey God rather than men." Something had changed. Not because Peter had suddenly discovered confidence inside himself, but because he believed he had seen Jesus alive after death. After that, every threat looked different. Ancient Christian tradition says Peter eventually went to Rome during the persecution under Nero. Rome was the heart of imperial power, and proclaiming another lord there was dangerous. According to early Christian memory, Peter was crucified. The famous tradition says he asked to be crucified upside down because he did not consider himself worthy to die in the same manner as Jesus. Whether every detail can be proven with modern precision is less important than the central memory. Peter died as a martyr. The man who once denied Jesus to save himself later accepted death rather than deny him again. Then there was Andrew, Peter's brother. Andrew often stands in Peter's shadow, but his role is quietly beautiful. If Peter was the one who spoke loudly, Andrew was often the one who brought people close. He was the one who first found Peter and said, "We have found the Messiah." That means Peter's public story began with Andrew's quiet faithfulness. Andrew also appears during the feeding of the 5,000. When the crowd was hungry and the problem seemed impossible, Andrew noticed a boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish. He did not pretend it was enough. He simply brought what was available to Jesus. That seems to have been Andrew's pattern, not making himself the center but bringing people and needs to Christ. Tradition says Andrew carried the message into regions connected with Greece and the area around the Black Sea. He is especially associated with Patras, where he was said to have been crucified on an X-shaped cross. Later generations would call it St. Andrew's Cross. The tradition says he continued preaching even from that cross before he died. Whether we approach every detail with caution or devotion, the meaning is clear. Andrew was remembered as a witness who remained faithful to the end. The quiet brother who brought Peter to Jesus spent his life bringing others until his own body was fastened to wood because he would not stop. And then we meet James, the son of Zebedee, the brother of John. Jesus called James and John sons of thunder, and that nickname tells us a lot. They were intense men. When a Samaritan village rejected Jesus, they wanted to call down fire from heaven. They also wanted seats of honor in the kingdom. They imagined glory, but they did not yet understand the suffering that would come before it. Jesus asked them, "Are you able to drink the cup that I am to drink?" They said yes, probably without knowing what they were saying. But James would learn. He was part of the inner circle. He saw the transfiguration. He was near Jesus in Gethsemane, and among the 12, he became the first to die. The book of Acts records his death with shocking simplicity. Herod Agrippa killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. No long speech, no dramatic scene. Just one sentence and a life poured out. James died early when the Christian movement was still young, fragile, and dangerous. The disciples had not gained wealth, armies, or protection. From the outside, it would have looked easy to crush. But James did not walk away. The son of thunder, who once wanted fire to fall on others, became the first of the 12 to have the sword fall on him. So even at the beginning of this story, a pattern appears. Peter the denier becomes Peter the martyr. Andrew the quiet bringer carries the message until death. James the ambitious son of thunder becomes the first apostolic blood spilled by the sword. These men were different in personality, background, and weakness. But after the resurrection, they moved in the same direction. They testified. They suffered. They did not take back what they said they had seen. And that leaves us with a question we cannot avoid: what could make men like this change so completely? Their answer was simple, dangerous, and repeated until death. Jesus was crucified and God raised him from the dead. But not every disciple's story ended quickly. Some were called to die early. Others were called to live long enough to carry memories that must have become heavier with every passing year. And no one carried that weight more deeply than John, the brother of James. John had once been a son of thunder, a man with enough fire in his heart to ask whether heaven should burn a Samaritan village that rejected Jesus. But by the end of his life, the same man would write more about love than almost anyone else in the New Testament. That transformation is not small. It is one thing for a gentleman to speak about love. It is another thing for a thunderous man to be remade into a witness of love after watching his brother die, his friends suffer, and the world reject the one he knew as Lord. John was not a distant observer of Jesus' life. He was brought close. He saw what many others did not see. He was there on the mountain when Jesus was transfigured. He was there in the garden when Jesus prayed in agony. And according to the gospel account, he was near the cross when many others had fled. While Peter denied Jesus, while the others scattered, John stood close enough to hear Jesus speak to his mother. That detail matters. John did not merely hear sermons. He saw glory on the mountain and horror at Golgotha. He saw the face of Jesus shine, and he saw that same face covered in blood. His testimony came from both light and darkness, and then John lived. That may sound less dramatic than martyrdom, but sometimes survival is its own kind of suffering. Tradition says John was exiled to the island of Patmos during a time of Roman pressure on kindest Christians. Patmos was not a place of comfort. It was a lonely island in the Aegean Sea, the kind of place where an empire could send a man it wanted to silence. John was not killed like his brother James. He was isolated. He was removed. He was made to live with memory. And there, in exile, he received the visions that became the book of Revelation: beasts and thrones, judgment and worship, suffering and victory, the Lamb who was slain and yet reigns. By the time John was old, he had become the last living voice of a generation almost completely gone. Imagine what that must have felt like. Peter was gone, James was gone, Andrew was gone. One by one, the men who had walked the roads with Jesus had disappeared into martyrdom, exile, or distant mission fields. John remained carrying stories that no one else could tell in quite the same way. And when he wrote as an old man, his words did not sound like the restless ambition of youth. They sounded like someone who had seen everything burn away except what was eternal. God is love. That was not a slogan to John. That was the conclusion of a life spent close to Jesus, close to suffering, and close to the cost of witness. John is often remembered as the only one of the 12 who died of old age. But that does not mean his life was easy. To outlive everyone you love can be a painful calling. To keep testifying after the others are dead requires a different kind of courage. John's witness was not only in dying, but in remaining. He remained long enough to tell the church again and again that the center of the Christian life was not power, revenge, or fear. It was love rooted in truth. The Son of Thunder became the apostle of love. That alone should make us pause. Then there was Philip, another disciple from Bethsaida, the same town connected with Peter and Andrew. Philip comes across in the Gospels as practical, careful, and realistic. When Jesus looked at a hungry crowd and asked where they could buy bread for all those people, Philip immediately calculated the problem. He said that 200 denarii would not be enough to give each person even a little. Philip saw the numbers. He saw the limits. He saw the impossibility. And honestly, many of us understand him. Some people see possibilities first. Others see the budget. Philip saw the budget, but that does not make Philip faithless. It makes him human. He was the kind of man who wanted things to make sense. He did not seem reckless or dramatic. He was not Peter with a sword. He was not James calling for fire. He was the disciple who looked at a crowd and thought, "This does not add up." And yet Jesus chose him. That is important. Jesus did not choose only bold personalities. He did not choose only men who naturally spoke in visions and dreams. He also chose the practical man, the calculator, the one who needed to process reality through what could be counted and seen. And still Philip had a beautiful kind of faith. When he encountered Nathanael, he did not try to win an argument with a polished speech. He simply said, "Come and see." Those 3 words reveal something powerful. Philip may not have had all the answers, but he knew where to point. He did not say, "Let me explain everything." He said, "Come and see for yourself." That is often the most honest invitation faith can give. Not pressure, not performance, just an open door. Tradition says Philip later preached in regions of Asia Minor, especially around Phrygia. Accounts of his death vary, but they commonly remember him as dying violently for his witness, with some traditions describing crucifixion. Again, we should be careful not to pretend that every detail can be proven with the same strength. But the memory of Philip as a faithful witness who carried the message beyond his home is ancient and strong. The practical disciple, the one who once calculated what could not be done, spent his life proclaiming what God had done. The man who saw insufficiency in the face of a hungry crowd became a messenger of abundance. Then we come to Bartholomew, often identified by many scholars with Nathanael from the Gospel of John. If that connection is correct, then Bartholomew may have one of the most relatable introductions in the entire story. When Philip told him they had found the one Moses and the prophets wrote about, Jesus of Nazareth, Nathanael answered with sharp honesty, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" That is not polite religious language. That is skepticism, maybe even prejudice. Nazareth was not impressive. It was not the kind of place people expected God's Messiah to come from. Nathanael did not hide his doubts behind fake spirituality. He said what he thought, and Jesus did not reject him for it. When Jesus saw him coming, he said, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit." That is a remarkable statement. Jesus saw through Nathanael's skepticism and recognized honesty underneath it. Some people doubt because they do not want truth. Others doubt because they refuse to pretend. Nathanael seems to belong to the second group. He was not easily impressed. He would not clap because everyone else was clapping. He wanted reality, not performance. And when he encountered Jesus, his skepticism gave way to confession. The traditions about Bartholomew's missionary journeys stretch across several regions: India, Armenia, Arabia, and beyond. His death is remembered as one of the most brutal among the apostles. Ancient tradition says he was flayed alive and then beheaded. It is a horrifying image, and Christian art has never forgotten it. Bartholomew is often shown holding his own skin, a symbol so disturbing because it points to the extreme cost associated with his witness. The honest skeptic became a man willing to endure unimaginable suffering rather than deny the one he had come to know. That brings us to Matthew, one of the most socially shocking choices Jesus ever made. Matthew was a tax collector. In first-century Jewish society, that meant much more than someone with an unpopular job. A tax collector working under Roman authority was seen as a collaborator with the occupying empire. To many of his own people, Matthew was not just annoying, he was a traitor. He collected money from his fellow Jews under the shadow of Rome, and tax collectors were often associated with greed, corruption, and religious impurity. Good people avoided men like Matthew. Religious people judged them from a distance. Jesus sat at the table with them. That moment is easy to read too quickly. Jesus did not call Matthew after Matthew had repaired his reputation. He did not wait for society to approve of him. He saw him sitting at the tax booth and said, "Follow me." 2 words, and Matthew got up. Behind that simple sentence is an entire world collapsing. Matthew left a position that may have brought him money but cost him dignity. He left the table where he had been known as a sinner and followed the one who looked at him as a man worth calling. That kind of recognition can break a person open. Sometimes grace is not first experienced as a doctrine. Sometimes it is experienced as the shock of being seen by someone who should have despised you but does not. Matthew's gospel would later emphasize Jesus as the fulfillment of Israel's scriptures, which is deeply meaningful when you remember who Matthew had been. The man seen as a collaborator and outsider became a writer, connecting Jesus to the story of Abraham, David, prophecy, kingdom, and covenant. The rejected tax collector became a witness to the king. Tradition places Matthew's later ministry in regions such as his death is also reported differently in various sources, but many traditions remember him as a martyr. What remains constant is the image of a man who did not stay where Jesus found him. He went out. He testified. He carried the message beyond the borders of the life he once knew. And then there is Thomas, perhaps the most modern of them all. Thomas is often remembered with one word: doubting. But that label is too small. Thomas was not a shallow doubter. He was not mocking the others. He was wounded, honest, and unwilling to build faith on someone else's emotional excitement. When the disciples told him they had seen the Lord, Thomas answered, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe." That sentence is raw. It is not polished. It is not religiously safe. But it is honest. And Jesus met him there. He did not shame Thomas for needing evidence. He came to him and said, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." The resurrection faith of Thomas was not secondhand. It was not built on the enthusiasm of the group. It was built on encounter. The skeptic was invited to touch the wounds. And from that moment came one of the strongest confessions in the gospel: "My Lord and my God." Tradition says Thomas traveled farther east than any of the others, reaching India and establishing Christian communities along the Malabar coast. The Christians of St. Thomas in India have preserved this memory for centuries, not as a distant legend but as part of their identity. Thomas is said to have been martyred near present-day Chennai, pierced with a spear. There is something unforgettable about that. The man who demanded to touch the wounds of Jesus died bearing wounds of his own. The skeptic became a witness. The doubter became a missionary. The man who said, "Unless I see," eventually gave his life because he believed he had seen enough. So in John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, and Thomas, the pattern deepens. One survived long enough to become the old voice of love. One calculated impossibility and learned to point people toward Jesus. One brought honest skepticism and became a witness through suffering. One left the tax booth and carried grace beyond his shame. One demanded evidence and then carried his confession farther than anyone expected. They were not the same kind of men. They did not come with the same wounds, the same questions, or the same past. But after they encountered the risen Jesus, their lives bent toward the same conclusion. They could not go back. They could not pretend it had not happened. And when the world demanded silence, they chose testimony. By this point, a pattern is becoming impossible to ignore. These men were not copies of one another. Peter was impulsive. Andrew was quiet. James was fiery. John became the old witness of love. Philip was practical. Bartholomew was honest in his skepticism. Matthew carried the shame of a hated past. Thomas demanded proof before he believed. They came to Jesus with different wounds, different fears, and different expectations. But after the resurrection, their lives bent in the same direction. They did not hide. They did not build safe lives around a private memory. They scattered into the world with a public testimony: Jesus was crucified and they had seen him alive. Now we come to the disciples, whose names are less familiar, but whose place in the story matters deeply. The first is Simon the Zealot. His title alone tells us something powerful. He was not just Simon, he was Simon the Zealot. In first century Judea, that word carried political heat. Rome was not a distant government. Rome was soldiers in the streets, taxes taken from the poor foreign power, pressing down on the land of Israel. Many Jews longed for deliverance. Some believed that freedom had to come through resistance, even violence. A man called the Zealot likely carried that fire in his heart. He may have looked at the kingdom of God and imagined revolt swords and the fall of Rome. And then Jesus called him. That is already surprising. But what is even more surprising is who else. Jesus called Matthew the tax collector. Put those two men in the same room, and you can feel the tension. Matthew represented the kind of compromise Simon may have hated. He collected taxes under Roman authority. To many Jews, he looked like a traitor. Simon may have once seen men like Matthew as enemies of Israel. Yet Jesus placed them at the same table. He made them walk the same dusty roads, hear the same parables, sleep under the same skies, and learn the same kingdom. That kingdom did not erase their pasts by pretending they had never existed. It transformed them by giving them a greater Lord than their anger, their shame, or their politics. Simon's transformation is mostly hidden from us, but that silence does not make it small. We do not have a famous speech from him. We do not have a dramatic question recorded in the Gospels. But his presence among the 12 speaks loudly. He followed a Messiah who refused to lead an armed rebellion. He watched Jesus tell Peter to put away the sword. He heard Jesus teach love for enemies and prayer for persecutors. For a man formed by revolutionary passion, that must have been difficult. Jesus did not destroy Simon's courage. He purified it. The fire remained, but it no longer burned for revenge. It burned for witness. Tradition says Simon later preached in regions far from Galilee, often connected with Persia, sometimes alongside Judas Thaddeus. The details are not as clear as the traditions about Peter or John, but the memory that remains is consistent. Simon died as a martyr. Some traditions say he was killed violently, even sawn apart. Whether every detail can be proven or not, the shape of the story is striking. The man who may once have believed that God's kingdom needed violence ended his life not by killing for a cause, but by dying for a testimony. That is a different kind of revolution. It is the kind Jesus had been teaching all along. Then there is Judas Thaddeus, also called Jude or Lebbeus, a disciple often remembered mainly because he was not the other Judas. That is a strange burden to carry the same name as the betrayer. But his life reminds us that a name does not determine a destiny. One Judas walked into the night to sell his teacher. Another Judas remained, followed, and carried the message to the end. In the Gospel of John, Judas Thaddeus asks one recorded question: "Lord, how is it that you will manifest yourself to us and not to the world?" It is a deeply human question. Why not appear openly? Why not overwhelm the world with undeniable power? Why does God so often work through witness, love, obedience, and quiet presence instead of instant public display? Jesus' answer does not point to armies or thrones. He speaks of love, obedience, and divine nearness. He says that those who love him will keep his word, and the Father will love them, and they will come and make their home with them. Judas asked about public manifestation, but Jesus answered with inward dwelling. The kingdom would not begin as a political spectacle. It would begin in hearts made into a home for God. That answer must have shaped Judas Thaddeus deeply. Tradition later places him often with Simon the Zealot preaching in Persia. And like Simon, he is remembered as dying there for the faith he carried. There is something powerful about these lesser-known apostles. We often measure importance by how much space a person takes up in the story. But the kingdom of God does not work that way. Some people are given chapters. Others are given only a name. Some become central figures in sermons. Others serve almost completely in the shadows. Yet hiddenness is not the same as insignificance. Simon and Judas Thaddeus may not dominate the gospel narrative, but they still left everything, followed Jesus, and carried the witness outward. Their lives tell us that faithfulness does not need attention in order to be real. Then we meet James, the son of Alphaeus, often called James the Less or James the Younger. Even his title places him in the background. He is not James, the brother of John, not the son of thunder, not the one in the inner circle with Peter and John. He is the other James, the quieter James, the one history struggles to separate from other men with the same name. And that may be exactly why he matters. In a world obsessed with visibility, James the Less reminds us that being less known does not mean being less chosen. Jesus called him by name. Jesus wanted him among the 12. That is enough to give his life weight. The traditions about James the Less are complex, partly because the early Christian world had several important men named James. Some accounts connect him with ministry in Jerusalem. Others describe a violent death, possibly being thrown from a height, stoned, beaten, or clubbed. We should be careful not to claim certainty where history gives us fragments. But the larger memory remains. James did not belong to the story as decoration. He was a witness. He was sent. He suffered. He became part of the foundation of a movement that did not depend on fame but on testimony. His life gives the story a needed balance. Not every disciple had Peter's public drama. Not every disciple had Thomas's famous doubt or Matthew's dramatic calling from the tax booth. Some followed quietly. Some served without becoming the center of the scene. Some left behind only traces. But if the resurrection truly happened, then the quiet witnesses matter just as much as the famous ones. A testimony does not become stronger because the witness is loud. It becomes stronger because the witness is faithful. And then there is Matthias, the man chosen after Judas Iscariot was gone. His story begins in the shadow of betrayal. The circle of the 12 had been broken. That number mattered because it echoed the 12 tribes of Israel and symbolized the renewal of God's people. So the apostles sought someone to take Judas's place. But not just anyone could fill that role. The new apostle had to be someone who had been with them from the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and most importantly, someone who had witnessed the resurrection. That requirement tells us something crucial. Apostolic authority was not based on personality, talent, or ambition. It was based on witness. Matthias was chosen by lot after prayer. To modern ears, that may sound strange, almost random. But in the biblical world, casting lots in a sacred setting was a way of surrendering the decision to God. The apostles prayed, acknowledged that God knew every heart, and then Matthias was chosen. Imagine the weight of that calling. He was not stepping into an empty office created by success. He was stepping into a wound left by betrayal. Every time the restored 12 were remembered, the absence of Judas would still echo. Matthias became a sign that betrayal would not have the final word. We know very little about Matthias after this moment. Traditions place him in different regions, including Judea, Ethiopia, or areas farther east. His death is also described in different ways, with some traditions saying he was stoned and then beheaded. Again, the details are not all equally certain, but what matters is the shape of his memory. Matthias was not chosen for comfort. He was chosen for witness. By the time he stepped forward, the danger was already clear. Jesus had been crucified. The apostles had enemies. To join them was not a path to safety. It was a path into risk. Matthias also reminds us that some people are faithful long before anyone notices. He had followed from the beginning quietly enough that most readers do not know his name until he is chosen. But he had been there. He had seen. He had remained. And when the moment came, he was ready. That is a powerful kind of discipleship. Not sudden fame, not dramatic attention, just steady presence until God calls a hidden witness forward. So in Simon the Zealot, Judas the Deus, James the Less, and Matthias, we see another side of the 12. Simon shows us that Jesus can turn political rage into holy courage. Judas the Deus shows us that confusion can become obedience. James the Less shows us that hiddenness is not insignificance. Matthias shows us that God can raise a witness from the place betrayal left empty. These men do not have the most famous stories, but their lives strengthen the pattern. Different backgrounds, different personalities, different levels of visibility. Yet the same direction after the resurrection. Outward, costly, faithful testimony. And this brings us to the darkest contrast in the entire group. Because one man among the 12 did not go outward with witness. One man heard the same words, saw the same miracles, sat at the same table, and still chose another path. To understand the courage of the apostles, we must also face the tragedy of Judas Iscariot. He is not just the villain at the edge of the story. He is the warning inside it. And then there is Judas Iscariot. No story of the 12 can be honest without him. His name sits inside the list like an open wound. He walked the same roads as the others. He heard the same teachings. He saw the same miracles. He sat at the same table. He was close enough to Jesus that the others did not immediately suspect him, and yet his heart was moving in another direction long before his feet walked out into the night. Judas is not just the villain at the edge of the story. He is the warning inside it. He shows us that a person can be near holy things and still remain unchanged. A man can hear truth every day and still prefer his own calculation. A man can stand close to Jesus and still never surrender. The Gospels tell us that Judas carried the common money bag. That detail matters. He was trusted with something practical and important. He was not treated like an obvious outsider from the beginning. He had a place. He had responsibility. He belonged visibly among the 12. But John's Gospel adds a darker detail Judas used to take what was put into the money bag. Before he betrayed Jesus openly, he had already been betraying him privately. That is often how spiritual collapse begins. Not with one sudden act of darkness, but with small permissions given in secret. A little greed, a little compromise, a little double life. Judas did not become Judas in one night. The night only revealed what had already been growing in him. That may be the most frightening part of his story. Judas saw what Peter saw. Judas heard what John heard. Judas watched Jesus heal the sick, feed the hungry, calm storms, forgive sinners and raise the dead. He saw mercy up close. He saw holiness without cruelty. He saw power without pride. And still something in him stayed closed. The Bible does not tell us every motive inside Judas. Maybe he was disappointed that Jesus did not become the kind of Messiah he expected. Maybe he wanted a kingdom with visible power and personal reward. Maybe greed slowly trained him to measure everything by what it could give him. We do not know everything, but we know enough to see the tragedy. Judas had access to the light, but he chose the dark. During the Last Supper, Jesus says that one of them will betray him. The room becomes tense, but the disciples do not immediately point at Judas. They do not say, "We knew it." Instead, each one begins to ask, "Is it I, Lord?" That moment reveals how hidden Judas's betrayal was. He looked close. He sounded close. He belonged to the group. But when Judas speaks, his words reveal distance. The others say, "Lord." Judas says, "Rabbi," "Teacher," respectful but not surrendered, accurate but not enough. It is possible to call Jesus a teacher and still refuse him as Lord. Then comes the price, 30 pieces of silver. It was not a fortune. It was not a king's ransom. It was the price associated with the value of a slave. That is the horror of it. Judas did not merely betray Jesus. He accepted a small, shameful price for him. And that is how sin often works. From the outside, the trade looks insane. Truth for comfort, peace for control, God for money, eternity for a moment. But inside temptation, the exchange can feel reasonable. Judas counted the coins, but he did not understand what he was losing. The betrayal itself is painfully intimate. Judas does not identify Jesus from a distance. He comes close and gives him a kiss. A kiss should have been a sign of respect, loyalty, and friendship. Judas takes a symbol of love and turns it into a weapon. That is why the scene feels so cold. He does not approach Jesus like an enemy. He approaches him like a friend. And Jesus, knowing everything, still calls him friend. Judas arrives with a crowd carrying swords and clubs, but Jesus is not confused. He is not surprised. Darkness is moving, but God is not out of control. After Jesus is condemned, Judas begins to feel the weight of what he has done. Matthew says he felt remorse. He brought the silver back to the chief priests and elders and said, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." Those words were true, but guilt is not the same as healing. Judas returned the money, but he did not return to Jesus. He confessed his sin to men who had used him, not to the Lord, who could have shown mercy. The priests answered with cold indifference. "What is that to us? See to it yourself." That is how evil often works. It welcomes a person when he is useful, then abandons him when the consequences arrive. Judas throws the coins into the temple and leaves. The money that had seemed worth the betrayal now becomes unbearable to hold. But dropping the silver cannot undo the kiss. It cannot erase the arrest. It cannot wash the blood from his conscience. The priests, suddenly concerned with religious rules, decide they cannot put the money into the treasury because it is blood money. So they use it to buy the potter's field, a burial place for strangers. Even the money of betrayal ends in a field of death. Judas's final end is lonely and devastating. Matthew says he went away and hanged himself. Acts describes his death in harsh physical terms connected with the field, later called the field of blood. However, the details are understood together. The meaning is clear. Judas did not die as a witness. He did not die surrounded by brothers. He did not die testifying before rulers. He died in ruin, swallowed by the consequence of betrayal. His story is not remembered with honor, but with warning. And here, the contrast becomes impossible to miss. Peter also failed. Peter denied Jesus 3 times. But Peter's failure drove him to tears, and those tears became the beginning of restoration. Judas's failure drove him into isolation. The difference was not that Peter's sin was small and Judas's sin was large. Both were terrible. The difference was where they went with their guilt. Peter remained close enough to be restored. Judas ran away from mercy. One man let failure drive him back toward grace. The other let failure drive him into despair. That is why Judas is so uncomfortable. He is not simply the bad one among good men. On the night Jesus said one of them would betray him, every disciple felt the question pierce his own heart. Is it I, Lord? That is how Judas's story should be heard. Not with pride, not with distance, not with the easy thought I would never. Peter said he would never fall away, and only hours later he denied Jesus. The human heart is more fragile than it wants to admit. Judas warns us that closeness to religious things is not the same as love for Christ. Knowledge is not the same as surrender. Opportunity is not the same as transformation. But Judas also makes the witness of the others stronger, because he proves that the disciples were not simply carried along by group emotion. One of them chose differently. One of them had the same environment and rejected the path. That means the faithfulness of the others was not automatic. Peter still had to stand. John still had to endure. Thomas still had to believe. Matthew still had to leave his past behind. Simon still had to lay down the sword in his heart. Each man had to answer for himself. Judas shows that proximity alone does not save. Response matters. And after Judas was gone, the apostles did something remarkable. They did not hide the betrayal. They did not edit the story to protect their image. If they had been inventing a movement to make themselves look powerful, Judas would have been an embarrassing detail. One of the 12 chosen by Jesus, trusted with the money present at the final meal, became the betrayer. That is not the kind of detail propaganda usually preserves. But the early Christians kept it because their message was not built on the perfection of the disciples. It was built on the truth of Christ. That honesty matters. Christianity did not begin with impressive men claiming spiritual greatness. It began with frightened, flawed, confused men claiming that God had acted in history. Peter denied. Thomas doubted. James and John misunderstood. Matthew had a shameful past. Simon carried political fire. Judas betrayed. The Gospels do not airbrush them. And somehow, that makes their witness stronger. They were not trying to create legends of perfect founders. They were telling the truth about broken men and a risen Lord. So, the story of Judas leaves us with a serious question. What do we do with what we have seen? Judas saw much and surrendered little. The others saw, failed, broke, wept, returned, and finally gave everything. On one side stands the man who sold his testimony and died in silence. On the other side stand the witnesses who carried their testimony into prison, exile, suffering, and death. They had no empire behind them, no army protecting them, no obvious earthly reward. What they had was one claim: Jesus had risen. And if that claim was false, they suffered for nothing. But if it was true, then their lives make sense in a way no other explanation fully satisfies. That is where the final part must take us. Not simply into another list of deaths, but into the meaning of the whole pattern. Why did they keep going? Why did they refuse to deny what they had seen? Why did their testimony survive the pressure of prison, exile, torture, and execution? In the end, the story of the apostles is not only about how they died, it is about what they believed was worth more than staying alive. So now the pattern is complete. These were not perfect men. They were not fearless men. They were not men who naturally looked ready to change the world. One denied Jesus. One doubted him. Two wanted honor before they understood suffering. One had worked for Rome. One may have once dreamed of violent revolution against Rome. Several are remembered only in fragments. And one betrayed him. Yet from this broken circle came a testimony that crossed borders, languages, empires, and centuries. That testimony was not complicated at its center. They said Jesus of Nazareth had been crucified, buried, and raised from the dead. They said they had seen him alive, and for that claim they were willing to lose everything. This is what makes their story different from ordinary martyrdom. Many people in history have died for beliefs. Some have died for political causes. Some have died for religious traditions they inherited. Some have died for ideas they believed were true because someone else taught them. But the apostles were standing on something more direct. They were not dying for a rumor passed down from another generation. They were not dying for a sacred story they had received from their ancestors. They were dying for a claim tied to their own eyes, their own ears, their own hands, their own memory. Their message was not, "We think this may be spiritually meaningful." Their message was, "We saw him." That does not remove every question. It does not make every later tradition equally certain. Some details about where each apostle traveled or exactly how each one died are preserved with different levels of historical strength. A serious person should admit that, but the larger picture remains powerful. The men closest to Jesus did not behave like people protecting a lie. They did not gain comfort, wealth, safety, or political power from their testimony. In the beginning, they gained danger. They gained prison. They gained rejection. They gained exile. They gained death. And still they kept speaking. Think about Peter again. The man who once denied Jesus beside a fire later died in Rome rather than deny him again. Think about Thomas. The man who refused to believe without touching the wounds carried that confession far beyond the land where it began. Think about Matthew. The tax collector who had once been seen as a traitor became a witness to the king. Think about John, the last survivor, old and exiled, still waiting for the Lord he had known, still writing with the tenderness of a man who had seen too much to waste words on anything less than love. Think about the quieter ones too, Simon, Jude, James, the less Matthias. Their names may not be as famous, but their direction was the same. Outward, costly, faithful. And then think about Judas. Judas saw the same light and chose darkness. His story reminds us that seeing is not the same as surrendering. Proximity is not the same as faith. A person can sit at the table and still walk into the night. That warning gives the whole story a sharper edge. The apostles were not machines automatically forced into belief. Each man had to respond. Judas responded one way. The others, even after failure, responded another. Peter wept and returned. Thomas doubted and then confessed. Matthew left his booth. Simon laid down the sword in his heart. John endured until old age. Their testimony was not automatic. It was chosen. So what are we supposed to do with this? Not merely admire them. The Bible does not give us the apostles so we can turn them into distant heroes and then keep them safely behind stained glass. Their lives press a question against us. What would make ordinary men live like this? What would make them scatter across the known world with no guarantee of safety? What would make them keep preaching when silence would have been easier? What would make them accept suffering rather than take back one sentence, "We have seen the Lord"? There are only a few basic possibilities. Maybe they lied. But if they lied, then we have to believe that they knowingly carried that lie through hunger, prison beatings, exile, and death without any clear reward. Maybe they were confused. But confusion does not easily explain the consistency of their witness, the physical nature of their claim, or the way their fear turned into courage after they believed they had encountered the risen Christ. Or maybe they were telling the truth. Maybe something happened in Jerusalem that they could not deny because it had happened not only in their hearts but in front of them. Maybe they really did see the crucified Jesus alive again. That possibility is why their story has never gone away. Empires tried to silence it. Philosophers tried to explain it away. Persecutors tried to bury it under fear. But the testimony kept moving. It moved through roads and ports, homes and prisons, letters and sermons, ordinary conversations and public trials. It moved not because the apostles were powerful, but because they believed the risen Christ was. They had no army at the beginning. They had no throne. They had no empire. What they had was witness. And somehow witness proved stronger than the world expected. The deaths of the apostles do not ask us to shut off our minds. They ask us to take the question seriously. These men were not asking the world to believe in a vague symbol. They were announcing an event. They were saying that death had been broken open from the inside. They were saying that Jesus was not merely a teacher who died nobly, not merely a prophet remembered lovingly, not merely a moral example preserved by followers who missed him. They were saying he was alive, and if that was true, then everything changed. God had acted. Sin was not final. Rome was not ultimate. Death was not the end. That is why their courage makes sense. A man who believes death is the final word will do almost anything to escape it. But a man who believes he has seen death defeated becomes very difficult to threaten. What can you take from him that Christ cannot restore? What prison can hold the hope he carries? What sword can erase what he has seen? That does not mean the apostles wanted to die. They were not chasing pain. They were not romanticizing suffering. They wanted to preach, to build churches, to strengthen believers, to carry the message farther. But when death came as the price of faithfulness, they did not treat it as defeat. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson. Their deaths matter because their lives had already been given. Long before the sword, the cross, the spear, or exile, they had already surrendered. They had left nets, tables, ambitions, fears, and old identities behind. Martyrdom was not the beginning of their witness. It was the final seal on a witness they had been living for years. They did not become true at the moment of death. Death simply revealed how deeply they believed what they had been saying all along. Near the end of the New Testament, the old apostle John records a final promise: "Surely I am coming soon." And John answers, "Amen. Come, Lord Jesus." Those are not the words of a man playing with religious poetry. They are the words of someone who had waited a lifetime. Someone who had known Jesus, lost him, seen him alive, watched his brothers die, endured exile, and still carried hope. After all the years, after all the graves, after all the suffering, John's heart still leaned forward. Come, Lord Jesus. That is where the story of the 12 leaves us. Not with statues, not with legends floating above history, but with men, real men, weak men, changed men, men who saw something they believed was worth more than comfort, reputation, safety, and life itself. Their story does not force anyone to believe, but it does ask every honest person to stop, listen, and consider the weight of their witness, because if they were wrong, then their courage is one of history's strangest mysteries. But if they were right, then the question is no longer only why they died. The question is what we will do with the one they died proclaiming.